By mid-November, Jack Shelley was cleared to follow the U.S. First Army at Spa, Belgium, the first American contingent to cross the German frontier. Before he left, he assembled a dozen Iowa soldiers in a radio studio in Paris to record a special broadcast, intended to be a Christmas present for families listening back home.
Hello, WHO. This is your war correspondent, Jack Shelley, with the American First Army on the German frontier. During this broadcast, we're going to have the real pleasure of hearing the voices of more than a dozen Iowa men, voices that haven't been heard by their families and friends for over a year. And at this Christmas season, when the home front and the war front are bound together more than ever by strong emotional ties, these men are very glad to have the chance to send their voices and their Christmas greetings back to Iowa. To start out, here's Private First Class Edwin Miller of Hartley, Iowa. Tell me, are you married?
Yes, I am, Jack. My wife teaches school in Hartley, and I'd sure like to be seeing her this Christmas.
And I know she feels the same way.
The day after that recording, on December 16, came the Germans' last gasp. The Battle of the Bulge began. And WHO's Jack Shelley was there for one of the most brutal battles of the war.
And yet, ironically, it was fought in one of the most beautiful areas you could ever see, the Ardennes, which is covered with wooded hills, with little mountain streams running through them, with tiny narrow roads that only one tank being stopped on it will stop a whole column, and with snow steadily coming down, picture postcard beauty, and terrible fighting going on.
This war is full of ironies, and not the least is the fact that along most of this flaming Western Front, men are killing each other in some of the most serenely beautiful country in the world. It's a land of sharply climbing hills and swiftly descending valleys, of pastures and dense forests of pine, of curving, steeply graded, narrow roads and small rushing streams, cold, dark water racing and splashing over rocky beds. Think of the most beautiful Christmas card scenes you ever saw. Think of the most tranquil, snowy white etchings of winter wonderlands any artist ever drew. They're all here on a road that leads to war, a road that swarms with tanks and trucks and fighting men. But as so often happens in war, what is beautiful to the eye is a bitter, heartbreaking disappointment to the men who slog their way forward to the attack. This winter wonderland, to our First Army, is perhaps even more of a foe than the Germans who oppose our assault into the Bulge. There is precious little beauty where fighting has been, but that is not a loss to mourn about. Time will pass, and new pine trees and new snow will hide the scars. Even the foxholes and the shell pits will lose their harsh outlines and blend with surrounding terrain. But nothing will replace the loss of the men who die here. It'll take more than snow and new pine trees to hide the scars of those who are wounded here. There is sadness compounded in this wounding and this dying amid such unbelievable tranquil beauty. There's almost insupportable shock at the sight of red against that white snow, because there's only one way that red stain got there.
The combat people that I talked to didn't seem to resent the fact that you were able to leave them and go back to a safer locality. They were just kind of amazed that you showed up at all.
The Army was naturally preoccupied fighting the Battle of the Bulge, so no one cared that Jack Shelley was reporting from the front lines for longer than the 1 month he was allowed. Officials finally figured out he had overstayed his time, and by early February, he was making his way back home.
Most of the time we concentrated on individuals, used their names, told what they were doing, sent a message back home for them to their parents, and that was called Joe Blow reporting. But it had more heart and more human interest and more satisfaction to me and to the people back home than any other kind of reporting you could do.
All told, Plambeck and Shelley mentioned the names of around 960 servicemen they met along the way, providing proof to families at home that their loved one was still alive. And as Plambeck recalled, they sometimes even left a bit of home with the troops.
I didn't carry a gun, but I did have a bag in which had a lot of paper and pencils and an ear of corn. And I took that ear of corn out wherever I would go. And there'd be enough farm boys in there, they'd want a kernel. When I finished that hitch, there were no kernels of corn left on that ear of corn.
As Jack Shelley was returning to America in the spring of 1945, WHO renewed its commitment to covering the war by sending Herb Plambeck back to the European theater. When Plambeck arrived in Paris, he found a heavy steel combat helmet waiting for him. It was the same one Shelley wore in covering the Battle of the Bulge, and Plambeck would find it useful as he soon crossed the Rhine with General Patton's Third Army as they made their way to Berlin.
Hello, WHO. This is Herb Plambeck with the Third Army, again speaking from somewhere along the Western Front. Much of these past 2 weeks found me in Germany. The rest of the time was spent in Luxembourg and in the Alsace-Lorraine area of France. Most of my work, of course, has been with our doughboys and tank men, now forcing their way farther and farther into Hitler's fortress.
Herb Plambeck was on the scene for the last days of the European War. After 30 days with Patton's Third Army, he was reassigned to follow General Patch's Seventh Army. Along the way, his driver got lost. A one-day trip took 3 days, including accidentally crossing enemy lines, where a rather odd event took place.
My Jeep driver and I captured 2 towns ourselves, 2 towns, with the Burgermeister and his black hat down there and all of the officials and all the people with white flags waving there and guns stacked up this high. All of the guns they stacked up because I suppose they'd have the instructions what to do because they were going to have to surrender. And here I was, and I stood up in the Jeep with my, well, of course I had a uniform on, a helmet and everything, and I saluted the Burgermeister, stood up, and I speak German, and I told him, "Hab keine Angst, have no fear. The officials are coming, and you can surrender to them." And then we went on.
On April 30, 1945, WHO's Herb Plambeck was one of the first Americans to see the horrors of Dachau firsthand, only hours after the liberation of the camp. He took this photo of the death train, bodies stacked in boxcars, before the sight made him turn away in horror.
Things I could never have believed had I not actually seen them with my own eyes. Things you cannot be expected to believe. They're beyond human comprehension. I do not have the words at my command, and I doubt if anyone else has, with which to describe the heinous brutality, the absolutely unspeakable baseness, the tragedy seen at Dachau. It's simply too horrible to relate or to ask the airways to carry.
Heavy door, the kind you have on refrigerators. I pulled it open, and the stench from that room drove us back 6-8 feet. And then we looked in. That's about all we could do was look in. And there they were, the bodies of the people that had been gassed over here, stacked up like cordwood, one above the other, as many as 10 deep, one row after another, as far as you could see. Is a huge building. And we were pretty nauseated. Sickened is a better word, I think, and we just had to leave.
We pulled up to a railroad spur, and there I saw a train of death, 45 boxcars, some of them nearly half filled with human bodies, Poles, Russians, Jews, and people of all other lands and creeds. There were less than a dozen American correspondents and GIs in our party. The prisoners were still so joyous over their liberation less than 24 hours ago, they all but smothered us. To say I was frightened is putting it mildly. The salutes, embraces, kisses, and reverent words of praise we observed made us feel more humble than you know. I'm sure I need not tell you more. You can understand now why every GI, officer, correspondent, and other person who has had the terrifying responsibility of seeing the crime of Dachau has this unforgettable memory of Nazism deeply and unforgettably burned in his heart. This is Herb Plambeck, returning you to the land where things like Dachau must seem completely unreal, asking you to thank God you'll never know atrocities against mankind as we've seen them here. I return you now to WHO.
Just more than a week later, on May 8, 1945, the unconditional German surrender was announced, and the joy and relief was evident in the Iowa war correspondent's voice.
This is your war correspondent, Herb Plambeck, speaking from Germany on the evening of the glad day when the end of the war in Europe was announced
to our men here. This is another of those occasions when mere words cannot tell the full story. The story we've waited so long to bring you, and the one you've waited so long to hear. Unquestionably, you've known the joyous tidings for some hours. Undoubtedly, a great many of you have already uttered prayers of gratitude, just as many of your boys and the rest of us have in this part of the war-weary world. Perhaps there's already been some celebrating started in Old Wine, Somerset, Inwood, Centerville, Fort Madison, Indianola, West Side, Eldridge, Mitchellville, and every other town and city and community in Iowa, as well as in every other state. Here in Germany, as well as in Austria, where our 7th Army troops fought until Saturday, and where I was earlier today, at the time the news first reached us, and in every other part of Europe, VE Day will not be officially observed until Tuesday. But nevertheless, today is a day of prayerful gratitude.
Immediately after filing that report, Plambeck and another reporter joined 3 colleagues in a bit of a lark. They decided to find Adolf Hitler's mountaintop retreat, the Eagle's Nest, and in their words, to liberate it from Nazi control.
So they took the bayonet off, and Lochner went up and he etched in there this line, liberated May 8th, 1945, by, and then he put his name under it, Louis Lochner, AP. And then, of course, the rest of us followed suit, naturally. 25 years after that, I took my wife and children over there, and got in there, and I walked in the door, and I looked over to the fireplace, and there was a big picture above the fireplace. And my heart just sank. Oh, I've been telling my wife about this for 25 years, and everybody else, and now there's no proof. So she walked over, and she pulled this picture from the wall, the bottom part of it, is still behind it. I'll tell you, that made a fellow feel good.
In addition to autographing the wall, Plambeck took some souvenirs. This cup and saucer was taken from Hitler's Eagle's Nest dining room and brought back to Des Moines, where it held an honored place in the Plambeck home for decades. Before leaving Germany, Herb Plambeck obtained a rare wire recorder and traveled to meet up with Iowa soldiers who endured long trips in vehicles like this one, just to have the chance to say hello to their families on May 13, Mother's Day, 1945.
So that the day will be happier for some of our men here and their families back home, we arranged for greetings from quite a few of the men. These men speak for all your sons here. Their voices came to you by wire recording and on the magic wings of radio.
Our wire recorder is set up where we can see the majestic snow-capped Alps and other gorgeous sights here. With me is a fine group of Iowa men, and on this first weekend after VE Day, they're a happy lot, and no wonder. But in addition to the relief war's end has brought, these men are also overjoyed about the prospect of joining us on this Mother's Day program. First, to a stalwart soldier from Mystic, Iowa. His name is?
I am Sergeant Floyd Purvis from a farm near Mystic, and very grateful to extend a Mother's Day greeting from Austria.
You have the Combat Infantryman's badge and the Purple Heart with cluster, but your mother will be happy to learn you're looking great, and I'm sure you have a greeting.
Yes, on this special day, each of us are thinking of our precious mothers and hoping to join them all soon.